Germany 1923. Your life savings can't buy bread. The bank account that could have purchased a house 5 years ago is now worthless. But here's what nobody tells you. Some people not only survived, they thrived. Argentina 2001. The government freezes your bank account. When they finally let you access it, 66% of your money is gone overnight. Yet again, some people walked away unscathed. America 2025. $36 trillion in debt. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. The Federal Reserve printed $5 trillion in just 2 years. We're following the exact same pattern that preceded every major collapse in history. The difference between those who lose everything and those who survive isn't luck. It's not about being smarter or predicting the future. It's about following 5 ancient principles that have worked in every single collapse, from ancient Rome to modern day. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what those principles are and how to apply them right now, before it's too late. Most financial advice is garbage. Someone tells you to buy gold, sell stocks, invest in crypto. These are tactics, and tactics only work if your timing is perfect. But here's the problem. Nobody can time a collapse perfectly. Nobody. A principle is different. A principle is a fundamental truth that works regardless of when, where, or how the collapse happens. These 5 principles worked when gold was money in ancient Rome. They worked when paper money collapsed in Weimar Germany. They're working right now in countries experiencing currency crises. And they'll work in America, whether the collapse happens next year or in a decade. Most financial advice assumes the system keeps working. It assumes banks stay solvent, governments honor contracts, and property rights are enforced. In a collapse, every single one of those assumptions breaks. But principles? Principles remain bulletproof. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1923. You have 100,000 marks in the bank. You're wealthy. 5 years later, that same 100,000 marks can't buy a loaf of bread. The currency didn't just lose value, it became worthless paper. Every penny of paper wealth evaporated into thin air. But here's what's fascinating. People who owned hard assets came out fine. A farm in 1918 was still a farm in 1923. It grew the same crops, had the same real value. The price in marks went from thousands to trillions, but the farm itself never changed. It was real, it was tangible, and it couldn't be inflated away. Zimbabwe, 2008. Hyperinflation hit 79.6 billion% per month. Let that sink in. Billion% per month. If you held Zimbabwean dollars, you were completely wiped out. But farmers who owned land and livestock, they preserve their wealth because land produces food regardless of what happens to paper money. Argentina between 2001 and 2002 shows this even more clearly. The government forcibly converted dollar deposits to pesos at a rigged rate, and people lost 66% overnight. But real estate stayed real estate. Farmland stayed farmland. The asset didn't evaporate because it was real. Right now in America, most wealth exists as paper claims. Your stock portfolio is a claim on corporate earnings. Your bonds are claims on repayment. Your bank account is just a claim on the bank's promise to pay you. In normal times, these claims work perfectly. But in a collapse, the entire system stops functioning. Courts get overwhelmed, banks fail, governments default, markets freeze, and suddenly all those paper claims become worthless. But a house is still a house. Gold is still gold. Farmland still produces food. The asset has value that exists independently of any financial system. When everything burns, hard assets remain standing. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1933. The stock market collapsed 89%. If you owned stocks hoping to sell them for a profit, you lost almost everything. But if you owned productive assets directly like a working farm or rental property, you still received the production. The farm produced food you could eat or sell. The rental property provided housing people desperately needed. Here's the critical distinction. Productive assets generate value independent of what the market thinks they're worth. A farm produces food whether the stock market is at 381 or 41. It produces food whether anyone wants to buy your farm or not. The asset creates real value. Venezuela in the 2010s shows this perfectly. The stock market went up 100,000% in bolivars. Sounds amazing until you realize the bolivar lost 99.9% of its value. Stock market gains were an illusion. But people who owned bakeries, farms, or transportation businesses thrived relatively. Why? Because a bakery produces bread, and people desperately needed bread. The bakery created real value that people would trade anything to get. Compare that to Venezuelan government bonds. They only had value if the government honored them. When the government defaulted, the bonds went to zero instantly. No production, no intrinsic value, just a promise that broke. In America today, most assets are purely speculative. People buy stocks hoping they go up. They buy Bitcoin hoping someone pays more later. They buy real estate planning to flip it. These assets don't produce anything. They only have value if you can sell them. And in a collapse, there are no buyers. A farm that grows food is productive. A rental property you own free and clear generates housing. A business that makes goods people actually need creates value. When collapse comes, speculation dies but production survives. Own things that produce and you'll have value no matter what happens to markets. In stable times, debt looks like leverage. You borrow to buy a house, it appreciates, you profit. Debt seems smart. But in collapse, all debt becomes a death sentence. Your income drops or disappears, but your debt doesn't. The bank still demands payment, and if you can't pay, they take everything. The Great Depression proves this brutally. During the 1920s, farmers borrowed to expand. Land prices were rising, crops were selling, borrowing made perfect sense. Then 1929 hit. Crop prices collapsed 50 to 70%. Farm income fell off a cliff. But the bank debt? It didn't decrease by 1 penny. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed. Families who had owned land for generations lost everything because of debt. Now compare that to farmers who owned their land free and clear. They struggled. Prices were terrible. Times were hard, but they survived. Without debt payments, they could live on whatever the farm produced. Same depression, same price collapse, completely different outcome. Debt-free farmers. Argentina 2001 shows the same pattern. Middle-class families had mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, their peso income fell 66%, but the mortgage payments stayed the same in dollars. Their income got cut by 2/3, but their debt didn't budge. They couldn't pay. Banks foreclosed, and people lost homes they'd been paying on for 10 or 15 years. People who owned homes free and clear kept their homes. Same crisis, same income collapse, but no debt meant no foreclosure. In America right now, households hold $17 trillion in debt. $12 trillion in mortgages, $1.6 trillion in auto loans, $1.6 trillion in student loans, $1 trillion in credit cards. When the crisis comes, that debt will destroy millions of families. The common argument is that inflation helps debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation runs 20%, your debt shrinks in real terms. This works if your income keeps pace with inflation. But in real collapses, income doesn't keep pace. It falls off a cliff while debt stays fixed. The only safe position is zero debt. If you own a house with a mortgage, you don't own a house. You own a leveraged bet that house prices stay high and your income stays steady. If you own a house free and clear, you own a house, period. No bank can take it. Debt is leverage and expansion. Debt is suicide and collapse. Every other form of wealth can be taken from you. Land can be seized. Gold can be confiscated. Money can be inflated. Businesses can be nationalized. But skills live in your brain, and they can't be taxed, confiscated, or inflated away. The Holocaust proves this in the most tragic way possible. Jewish families owned property, businesses, and vast wealth. All of it was confiscated by the Nazis, everything gone. But the Jews who survived often did so because of skills. Doctors, engineers, craftsmen, tailors, people with skills could work. They could trade labor for food. They could rebuild in new countries after the war. The wealthy merchant who owned property but had no practical skills starved. The skilled craftsman who owned nothing but knew how to build survived and eventually rebuilt his life. Soviet Union, 1917 to 1922. The Bolsheviks seized all private property overnight. Aristocrats who owned vast estates lost everything instantly. But engineers, doctors, and skilled workers maintained value because the Soviet state desperately needed them. Their skills gave them leverage even under communism. The aristocrat who owned 10,000 acres but couldn't farm starved. The blacksmith who owned nothing but could make tools survived. Vietnam, 1975. When Saigon fell, millions fled with nothing. They couldn't take property. They couldn't take businesses. The Vietnamese refugees who rebuilt most successfully in America were those with skills. Doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics arrived with absolutely nothing except their skills. Within one generation, they built successful lives from zero. In America 2025, most wealth sits in financial assets and real estate. These are not portable. If you need to leave, you can't take your house. You might not even be able to take money if capital controls get implemented. But skills in your head are guaranteed portable wealth. Yet most Americans have zero practical skills. Can you grow food, fix machines, build shelter, provide medical care? These skills have value in every economy, whether stable or collapsed. Develop skills that produce value independent of complex systems. Skills are the foundation of rebuildable wealth when everything else can be taken. When systems collapse, institutions fail completely. Banks close their doors. Governments lose authority. Police can't enforce laws. The entire institutional framework breaks down. But local networks of trusted relationships survive and become everything. Soviet Union, 1991 to 1998. The Soviet government dissolved. Currency became worthless. Pensions stopped. Supply chains broke. Grocery stores sat empty. Russians survived through local networks. Families shared resources. Neighbors traded with each other. Communities organized their own security and resource sharing. The people who survived best weren't the wealthiest on paper. They were people embedded in strong local networks. The isolated individual with money in the bank starved. The connected person with relationships thrived. Argentina 2001. When banks closed, neighborhood assemblies formed spontaneously. People organized locally to barter, share resources, and provide security. These informal networks became more important than the government. People embedded in these networks could trade skills for food and labor for goods. Those without networks struggled alone. Lebanon, 2019 to present. The pound lost 90% of its value. Banks closed. The government became completely dysfunctional. But Lebanon hasn't descended into total chaos. Why? Because Lebanon is organized around family and religious community networks. These networks provide what the government can't: security, trade, resources, support. Before modern institutions existed, all economic activity happened through trust networks. You traded with people you knew. You borrowed from people who knew you'd repay. Modern institutions let us scale beyond local trust, but when they fail, we revert back to trust networks instantly. In America today, most people are institutionally embedded but locally isolated. You have a bank account but don't know your neighbors. You rely on Walmart for food but don't know any local farmers. You rely on police but don't know anyone in your neighborhood. This is catastrophically fragile. When institutions fail, you have no fallback. Build local networks now, today. Know your neighbors. Develop reciprocal relationships. Embed yourself in a real community. As institutional trust fails, local trust becomes the most valuable asset you can possibly have. The person with strong local networks will survive. The isolated individual will not. Here's what makes these 5 principles so powerful. You don't need to predict exactly when collapse comes. You position yourself according to principles that survive collapse, and you're protected regardless of timing. Own hard assets instead of paper. Whether collapse comes in 2030 or 2040, hard assets preserve wealth in both stable times and crisis. You win either way. Own productive assets. If the system stays stable, productive assets generate income. If it collapses, you have real production. You win either way. Eliminate debt. In stable times, you have resilience and peace of mind. In collapse, you survive while debtors lose everything. You win either way. Develop valuable skills. In stable times, skills increase your income. In collapse, skills become your only portable wealth. You win either way. Build local networks. In stable times, you have community and support. In collapse, you have survival infrastructure. You win either way. These principles improve your life right now while protecting you later. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want to know exactly when collapse comes. But collapses don't announce themselves. By the time it's obvious to everyone, it's already too late to position yourself. The genius of following principles is they don't require prediction. You don't need to time anything perfectly. You simply position according to what survives and you're protected regardless. These 5 principles are ancient. They've survived 3,000 years because they're true in every economic system. Roman Empire, medieval Europe, Industrial Revolution, modern America. The principles never change because human nature doesn't change and mathematics doesn't change. When debt exceeds the ability to pay, collapse follows. Always. When currency gets debased, paper wealth evaporates. Always. When institutions fail, local networks matter. Always. These aren't predictions or theories. They're patterns that have repeated hundreds of times across every civilization. The American collapse will follow the same patterns. The specific tactics that work this time will be unique to our situation. But the principles remain identical. Hard assets survive. Productive assets generate value. Debt destroys. Skills are portable. Local networks outlast institutions. Position according to these principles now, and you survive what's coming. Ignore them and follow tactical advice instead, and you're gambling that you can time the collapse perfectly. That's a bet most people lose, and the cost of losing is everything. The window to position yourself is open right now. But it won't stay open forever. In every collapse throughout history, there was a moment when people could still act, could still position themselves, could still protect what mattered. And then that window closed. Don't be the person who wishes they had acted when they still could. These 5 principles worked in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina, in every collapse. They'll work in America. The only question is whether you'll follow them before the window closes or whether you'll wish you had after it's too late.